there's always a spark, and sometimes people associated with that spark, but that's is the condition that allows for that one small thing to happen that generates into a big thing.
America in the 1960s was primed for change. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and for the first time since the aftermath of the Civil War, African Americans nationwide saw a spark of hope for their futures. All across the country, that spark transformed into an inferno, which engulfed the major urban areas of America. In Watts, Los Angeles, Newark, 12th Street, Detroit, and Hough, Cleveland. With the conclusion of the World Wars and the continued growth in the industrial sector, many African Americans migrated from their former southern farms and homelands to the large urban centers of the North. As African Americans moved into the city, a substantial amount of the white population left the city for the white picket fences of the suburbs in order to avoid the immigrating blacks. This focused most of the middle to upper class wealth into the suburban areas of cities. As a result of this shunning by white citizens, African Americans formed exclusive communities in which almost entirely separate societies formed to protect other members and provide for those in need. However, African Americans were still prevented from gaining influential political power and could not control the politics surrounding their municipalities. This allowed for wealthy, racist white citizens to take control of government and abuse and ignore the rights of black citizens. This separation from the rest of the city inherently enticed lesser conditions for all those living in black communities. This isolation also caused African Americans to be hostile towards outsiders, especially white political leaders who were depriving them of their rights.
In the North, even though the laws were a little more lenient, individuals and different organizations really made sure that African Americans stayed in their place.
As many civil rights advocates soon found out, the racism and oppression towards blacks in the North was a whole other animal compared to that in the South. While urban centers in the North never officially established discriminatory laws, such as the Jim Crow laws, Northern blacks still struggled against an unending cycle of poverty and exclusion from the constitutional liberties promised by the federal government. The 1960s was a watershed decade for the civil rights movement, at the conclusion of which, official voting rights acts were implemented throughout the nation, and the highly publicized Civil Rights Act was signed into law. After much protest and violence from the African American community, these achievements were fulfilled. The black community now need only wait for equality. However, due to the lack of enforcement of the newly enacted legislation, the African American community's patience turned to insolence, which turned to anger, expressed in looting, arson, and violence, otherwise known as rioting. And so, over the 1960s, the urban centers of America exploded, with the pent-up frustration of a people who had finally had enough deferment of their ability to pursue happiness. Across the country, similar methods of protest against their economic and social oppression were seen, all of which occurred as a result of unreasonable anger on account of a relatively small event. The resulting violence was not expected by white Americans. After all, why should the African Americans be angry? The bill officially outlining their rights as fully fledged American citizens had been passed. However, it was inadequately enforced by the state and municipal government, keeping blacks downtrodden in their own caste, separated from everyone else.
And you began to see how folks began to feel that they weren't treated fairly, and the frustrations grew and grew. Then ultimately, it takes just a spark.
The frustration of African Americans primed many urban centers with the explosive emotions necessary for the riots which plagued 1960s America. The Hough region and its citizens were left economically crippled on account of the exodus of capital from the area. Due to this downturn, Hough saw its once proud neighborhoods deteriorate into destitution. The dissatisfaction of Hough residents arose primarily from the younger portion of the population, who still believed that America could be a place for all, rather than the elders of the town, who had submitted and been beaten down by the poverty of the district.
Lack of jobs, poor educational opportunities, actually just being shut out of the American dreams. You can only hold people down for a little while. Eventually, they are going to rise up.
Many small cases of vandalism had occurred as a prelude to the violence that was to come in July 1966. As the temperatures climbed, so did the tempers. The breaking point took place in the 79ers bar on the corner of Superior Avenue and 79th Street, on Monday, July 18, 1966, where the bar owner posts a sign with the words, "No water for niggers" written upon it. The African American community's response to this small action sparked one of the greatest riots in 1960s America.
You see, the sign is a sign, and I'm pretty sure there was probably signs like that all over the city of Cleveland at one point or another. Economic and political condition they had not created an environment where that was not acceptable anymore.
The violence and destruction wrought in the Hough community was on par with nothing else seen before or since in Cleveland. As the initial angry mob around the 79ers bar grew, a state of lawless disorder spread across the district, overwhelming the police force, which was woefully under-equipped for the situation at hand. In the absence of an effective police presence, the citizens of Hough began looting and burning the district indiscriminately.
The idea was that they turned within their own community and devastated their own community, particularly the business strips. And that's a phenomenon that happened in Watts, and it happened in many of the other riots.
After the first day of rioting, the governor of Ohio decided to call in the Ohio National Guard to quell the violence. The Guard arrived on Tuesday, July 19th, to a terrible sight. Destroyed buildings, guns being fired, and dying people greeted the Guard as they attempted to tame the town. However, within a few days, with the help of the National Guard, order had been more or less restored in Hough.
What happened during the riots was they set a lot of fires. It's just like a war zone. It was like a war zone.
With the riots officially ending on Saturday, July 23, 1966, and order having been restored, many white city leaders of Cleveland were overwhelmed by the sudden outburst of violence. In order to prevent such a thing from happening again, they ordered an official investigation to determine the underlying causes of the riots. The investigation was carried out by the Cleveland Grand Jury, and after a few weeks, the jury released their findings, stating that the riots were a, quote, outbreak of lawlessness and disorder, organized, precipitated, and exploited by a relatively small group of trained and disciplined professionals, some of whom are either members of or officers in the Communist Party. While acknowledging the severe economic conditions and tense relationship the Hough residents had with the police force, the jury attributed the chaos to communism, rather than discovering what the true causes were. However, much of the African American community was unimpressed by the grand jury's findings, and, in response, the unsatisfied Hough residents created the Cleveland Citizens Committee on Hough Disturbances. This committee launched its own investigations, uncovering brutal police atrocities against passive Hough residents, and assigning blame to the demoralizing economic conditions. Two notable people who recognized these problems were Ohio Representative Carl Stokes and Councilwoman Fannie Lewis. In 1967, Carl Stokes became mayor of Cleveland by promising the end to racial violence and promoting black political power. This made Stokes the first African American mayor of a major U.S. city. Both black and white citizens voted for Stokes because they feared another outbreak of violence and hoped that an African American mayor would be able to quiet the unrest in Cleveland. In this respect, Stokes succeeded, temporarily, as there were no riots in 1967. However, in 1968, Stokes' second year in office, riots, although less destructive, once again terrorized the city. Dismayed, the city looked to leaders like Fannie Lewis to combat the true causes of the riots.
Councilwoman Lewis came in, and that was her life. She created a new Hough. She created a Hough that you know today.
Fannie Lewis is remembered for lifelong commitment and tenacity towards improving the lives and environment of Hough residents. Most importantly, she, along with Stokes, supported the Urban Renewal Project, which was designed to develop the housing in the Hough area in order to attract middle-class people into the district.
Well, I'll tell you, Fannie Lewis, the area that's there now, all those apartment buildings and stuff, it was her tenacity that got it through.
Such efforts were made to improve the lives of all living in Hough, but on the whole, the project cannot be considered completed, as even to this day, there are areas of Hough that have not been improved since the riots. The 60s marked the beginning of a new era, one where new standards of social acceptability were drawn. The contentious problems of neglect and underrepresentation of blacks, which had been ignored for decades in America, were finally combated across the country. As the government was finally held accountable for ensuring the rights of its citizens, efforts were made by people of all races, classes, and statuses to usher in the equality all men had been promised for almost 200 years.